you've previously expressed sympathy for the goals of Extinction Rebellion, which remain a somewhat controversial group in some quarters, and they're clearly not being taken fully seriously in all quarters. And I was wondering, what do you think needs to change for those in power to take their concerns and a more radical view of what needs to be done to combat climate change seriously?
How long have you got? What Extinction Rebellion is doing is making manifest an enormously deep and widespread anxiety amongst the public everywhere, not just in this country, and all over the world. And actually, that was there before we had a year of pictures of everywhere burning and flooding and storming and all the rest of it. So they're making that manifest. And they are exposing an enormous failure of politics in this country. It's always important to understand that government has got two bits. There's an administrative bit, which by and large works fairly well. And then there's a political bit, which frankly is not working at all and seems to be incapable of taking the decisions that only government can take. And if you look not just at climate change, but across the board on all the issues of sustainable development, we don't have a problem with technology. We've got lots of technology, and they're not going to be economically problematic to solve. But they really do mean the pattern of winners and losers will change, and that's what politicians are supposed to do. And by and large, they're not doing it. They're trying to find ways in which everybody can win, and that's not the world we're living in.
I'm really interested in who partakes in Extinction Rebellion, and I've got a lot of friends who are partaking in Extinction Rebellion, and they're my age, and they feel incredibly guilty about the fact that our generation has done so well. Our generation, you know, the one above, my parents' generation, was the one straight after the war, where the vision of the post-war government was that we should be well educated, we should have clean water, we should have clean air, we should have housing, we should look after the environment, all those issues, and we should have a national health service. And both my parents started working in the National Health Service on day one of the National Health Service in 1948. And you know, they had this big vision for us all, and we were the beneficiaries, but you're not. And we were the beneficiaries, and we have squandered it. And I have been absolutely amazed to see people of all professions, but a lot of much older people who are there with Extinction Rebellion saying, actually, we want our voice heard too. And I think Extinction Rebellion has found a way of being intergenerational, but I also think it is also an incredibly white protest. And it just feels to me as though we've all got to find our own activism somewhere. I felt myself that, I've not been out with Extinction Rebellion, although I'm very sympathetic to people who found their activism in doing that. But my activism has been, how can I change policy? How can I change law? And so, as mentioned, I introduced what's now Wellbeing Future Generations Act, and that's made Wales the first country in the world which has legislation to protect future generations. But it doesn't have many powers, Wales, so it's trying to use the powers that it has. But I think you have to find your own activism. But I would hope that every single person in this room, if you're here today, you want to flip the script, and you should be thinking as you listen to much better contributors than me talk to you, and you talk to us about what you're going to do when you walk out that door. Because that's now the challenge for all of us, how we make this moment into a movement, how we flip our script. We know all the things that Tom has said. We can't allow governments to carry on getting away with it. And it doesn't mean joining Extinction Rebellion, although some people will do that, and there may be some people here who are in it. But it does mean doing something, both personally and in your workspace, to say, I am not prepared to carry on being part of the problem. And at the very least, if anybody here is not with a renewable energy company, change that tonight.
It is only with political will and actually collective action which you need at a government level, and in fact you need at an international level. And one of the things that would worry me is what are the international routes that we can use to make the global change that's necessary, not just the national change. And there is this interesting tension, isn't there? I think Jane's absolutely right. individuals have a responsibility and can make changes. But this is not an issue that can be solved by individuals.
That's right.
It can only be solved by global governance, actually, and that's where I think we might have a shortfall.
I agree with that. I certainly agree with that.
I think businesses are also an important player in this space. They consume a lot of energy, for instance. They produce a lot of emissions. The products and services they make are used by us, and then we add to the pollution and to the emissions and so on. So looking at that part of the picture, what individual businesses can and are doing up to a point, but also the regulations and the regulatory framework that creates the incentives for them to behave in a more constructive way. And then to the point of about individuals, I think as consumers, we can play a role. So we're not going to solve it on our own as individuals, but we can play a role. Because in talking to a lot of companies, they often have the incentive to reduce their footprint. It makes sense, economic sense to many of them to do it. But they say that a lot of the footprint comes from our behavior when we use their products and services in the home. So, we might boil a whole kettle of water to make a cup of tea. Or we might take a 10-minute shower when we can, things like that in the aggregate could make a big difference. It's a question of each of us then changing our behavior, potentially in small ways that add up.
Yeah, I have to say I absolutely agree with that last point, and I go back to mindset in terms of when we're talking about leadership or when we're talking about governance, of making everything conscious, and the consciousness has to start at the individual level to get to the global level. That's really, really important. So that habit changing, that behavioural changing does start with self. And actually, when that ripple effect happens, that's how we start to affect change within a wider community, because we're looking at it will be in our families, it will be in schools, it will be in the colleges, it will be everywhere, because we are acting as role models for those examples that we wish to see.
Tom, did you want to come back?
Well, just that Jacqui's right, actually, that if there isn't a collective action and that's done through politicians, if they don't provide the framework, then individuals and businesses can't play their part. And that's the bit that I was being critical of, has been the failure of the politicians to do that. We can't do it without the politicians.
And let's have a desperate outbreak of agreement here, because the problem, of course, for politicians is the timescale over which you make decisions. And for any politician, in a democracy where you're facing election, you are often not focused on a long enough timescale in order, and unless you are an enlightened politician like Jane, you're not focused on a long enough timescale.
But I think, can I just add one point about that interrelationship? I mean, I know, Wales is a small government. It's not like the UK government. I mean, in that sense, it's got much smaller arms of government, and it can wrap them round you in the sense that there are only 22 local authorities, there are only 6 health boards, etc. So you can actually get all the key government agencies in one room in Wales, which actually makes it very easy to engage. But I think there's a fundamental point about clarity of purpose, which actually is, unless you have that, then you're stuffed, basically. It's a very politician language. And one of the things that we found on the journey to creating a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act was that we had a duty to promote sustainable development, and nobody knew what it meant. So everybody kept saying, oh, we'll do that tomorrow. We won't do it today. And we'll write it into everything. So, of course, every minister said, we'll do it. But we didn't know what it was. And I think the big thing for me, as the minister who then got the responsibility for delivering on that, was to say, actually, we can't promote. It's too serious. We've got to deliver. And then when you say, right, everybody, we're going to have a law and we've got to deliver, what does that look like? And then politics and administration can engage. But I think that where we've got sometimes, and I think there's lots of examples in the UK government at the moment, particularly over COVID, where politics and the administration did not engage. And there were more and more additional views coming in from outside, and it was choose your view. And interesting enough, both Scotland and Wales chose to go with the health view. Both of them just went with a health view guiding the politics. So the tensions are less, but in many ways the opportunities are more.
Thank you.
Make your question pop. I hope it's not corny.